Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainalytics Podcast. My name is Doug Morrow, and I'm a director on the thematic research team here at Sustainalytics. And we're here today to talk about the emerging global cannabis industry and our recent spotlight on the topic, which is entitled The Budding Cannabis Industry, a First Look at ESG. I'm joined today by Martin Bezer. He's a senior associate on the thematic research team. Hello, Martin.
Hello.
Martin was the lead author of this spotlight, so we're really happy to have him here today. So thank you for joining. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're here obviously to talk about the spotlight. So let's, but maybe let's back up and just quickly get up to speed on what's going on. So how do you characterize the cannabis industry currently in Canada, and what are the changes in the works that we've all read about in the news with Justin Trudeau?
Canada's cannabis industry is currently in a state of transition. Canada's been working on legalizing recreational cannabis for some time. Cannabis has been legal for medical use in Canada since around 2001. During his 2015 election campaign, Justin Trudeau campaigned on the idea that recreational cannabis use should be legalized. On June 18th of this year, the Senate passed Bill C-45, which is also known as the Cannabis Act. By October 17, this law is expected to be in full force and recreational cannabis will be legal.
So how is this different? Like what exactly is this going to mean in terms of legalizing recreational cannabis use? How is that different for medical use, and what exactly is going to happen when this becomes law?
Well, currently Canada's medical marijuana industry is open for patients who are looking to use marijuana to relieve different types of symptoms they feel from certain diseases, but it's much more tightly regulated and confined to the space of medical use. When recreational cannabis comes into play, the market will be open to adults who want to use cannabis for their own enjoyment without having to introduce any kind of medical reasons to buy or produce cannabis on their own. Canada currently has more than 100 licensed medical marijuana growers. Many of these growers are likely to be moving into the recreational market.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
So this is great. So recreational cannabis use is going to become legal. So let's talk about it from an investor point of view. So how many companies right now are involved in this industry?
Currently, in Canada, there are 90 publicly traded companies involved in cannabis-related activities. Some of them are growers, others are producers, and others are involved in ancillary products and services. Canada's new policy on recreational marijuana will put Canada in a unique position globally. It'll be only the second country to legalize recreational use marijuana at the national level. Uruguay is the only other country to have introduced such a measure. The U.S. has a big market for both recreational and medical marijuana, but there are complexities in the U.S. market due to a tension between the way the federal government sees marijuana and the way different state-level governments see marijuana. It's illegal at the federal level, but legal in many state jurisdictions.
Right, I think I've read that. So California, for example, is one state where recreational cannabis use is legal, but at the federal level, it's a banned substance.
That's right.
In the U.S., we're talking.
It's considered a Schedule I substance. Yes.
Okay. So you mentioned 90 Canadian companies, but what about globally? What are we looking at here in terms of industry sizing globally? How many companies are forming industry globally?
We surveyed a broad universe of securities using different sources and found a total of 181 publicly traded companies that are involved in cannabis in one form or another. As we mentioned already, many of these are growers or distributors, but we also include in this number ancillary products and services companies such as human resources companies that are dedicated to finding employment for people who are looking to be involved in the cannabis industry, as well as financial services firms that are dedicated to investing in companies that are producing, selling, or somehow involved in the marijuana trade.
So did you do analysis on total revenues or total market cap? Like how big is this industry compared to others?
We did look at the market cap. Globally, the market cap of all these companies amounts to approximately $41 billion US dollars. We segmented the industry first by country to see which countries have the most exposure. Canada is by far the biggest market for cannabis companies. Canada is home to about 90 companies that have a total market capitalization of about 24 billion US dollars. The US is the next biggest market. It has around 75 companies with a total value in their market cap of about 12 billion US dollars. So the Canadian market has about twice the market capitalization of the US. And then these two markets dwarf all the other markets around the world.
So really the industry is quite small. That's what I'm hearing. So despite all the interest we've seen in the media about the emerging cannabis industry attracting investor attention, the total market cap of this industry in terms of the 181 companies is really quite small. So in many respects, it's still very much in its infancy.
It is in its infancy. Yeah, you can see this looking at the number of companies that are listed globally. And when you look at individual markets, you can see the biggest markets are the ones where governments have introduced some sort of legislation to make it easier for companies to operate. Canada is going to be special in this sense because it's going to have this federal policy that allows for recreational cannabis. It's going to make it easier for companies to set up their operations and work here, to be listed on Canadian exchanges, and even companies that have major operations in the US and are drawing much of their revenue from US customers are listing in Canada and basing their companies in Canada because of the ease of operating in Canada compared to a market like the US.
So you mentioned the TSX. That's interesting because I've read that some foreign exchanges in Europe, for instance, and even in the US, some companies are facing difficulties getting listed due to some complexities about how they treat cannabis. Is it fair to say Canada is at a relative, and the TSX and other exchanges are at a relative advantage globally when it comes to listing companies in this industry?
It will be easier for companies to list in Canada than it will be for them to list in other markets. Listing on an exchange is one advantage that a company will have, but another advantage will be something even simpler like doing business with a bank, having a bank provide the infrastructural support for taking credit card payments, for example. When you're operating in a regulatory environment where the government is potentially going to penalize a company for doing business with a cannabis retailer or distributor or producer, that will limit what kinds of activities a company can do.
Great. So then one other question here. You mentioned the two markets, recreational, medical. So is it fair to say that the incumbent medical companies, if you will, so the companies that are targeting the medical marijuana industry, are they planning to target this emerging recreational market as well, or how are companies strategizing around this legal transition that's going to take place in the fall?
Yeah, we expect to see a major shift in the way companies are targeting the market. Our screen that looks at product involvement in the cannabis space finds that most of the companies are currently focused on the medical market. We found that only 28% of the companies in our sample that are doing either production or distribution of cannabis are focused on the recreational market. The bulk of the companies are in the medical space. So as this market opens up in Canada and other markets are popping up in other jurisdictions, including about 30 states in the US, we think that this focus on the medical market is going to expand to include recreational use cannabis.
Great. So let's turn to ESG. So what should investors be thinking about from an ESG point of view when they consider or contemplate making investments in this industry? What are the key ESG issues?
We surveyed quite an extensive literature to look at the way that cannabis is produced and some of the environmental, social, and governance risks that cannabis companies face in this changing market. And we narrowed the ESG factors that cannabis companies are exposed to when it comes to risk to four broad categories. We have energy and emissions, pesticide use, land use, and water use. Cultivation is an energy intensive process, especially when you're growing cannabis indoors. Arguably, indoor cultivation is the most energy intensive industry in the United States. It currently consumes about 1% of the US overall electricity, and these growers that are consuming electricity for lighting, ventilation, controlling humidity and temperature are likely to face some pushback from regulators when it comes to the energy efficiency and associated emissions of their operations.
Great. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, clearly you have a controlled environment that takes a lot of energy to control. So they're going to be exposed to significant energy costs. That's quite interesting that your research found that the indoor cannabis industry is the single most, or among the most energy intensive sub-industries in the entire United States. So that certainly speaks to the scope of energy use that is actually used in cultivating indoor cannabis. What about pesticides? What did you find on that issue?
Pesticides are also concerning. We've seen over the past several years, companies in the US and Canada have been found to be selling cannabis products that have been tainted with banned chemicals, including pesticides that can be dangerous when they are heated and inhaled. As companies have been caught doing this, they've been facing product recalls, sometimes voluntary, sometimes enforced. Regulators have been upping the ante by introducing new penalties. In 2017, Health Canada introduced policy to fine companies up to $1 million per violation, and they can even take away the license of producers if they are found to be using banned pesticides in their production and supply chain. So we expect that this kind of ramping up of regulation and public scrutiny around what is going into these cannabis crops will escalate as more markets come into play.
So tell me about what companies are doing to manage these ESG issues. Do they have the types of programs and policies that we would normally expect to see, or is it more of a nascent ESG strategy? How would you characterize the industry on ESG?
Well, our ESG analysis focused on the big four cannabis players. These are Canopy, Aphria, Aurora, and MedRelief. These companies are huge in terms of their market capitalization. They account for about half of the Canadian market cap and about a third of the global market cap. So we take them to be leaders in overall expansion, and therefore we would expect them to be the first to really develop robust ESG policies. However, we've found that they are clearly underdeveloped in their policies and programs related to emissions and pesticides. We looked at indicators of emissions, such as their renewable energy programs, the scope of their greenhouse gas emissions, their GHG reduction programs, and actually found that none of these four companies has any kind of policy or program in place to address these issues. We also looked at pesticide-related indicators such as products and services management programs, their quality management systems, and found that only MedRelief of the big four is relatively well positioned to manage quality control and chemical use related to cannabis growth.
Interesting. So, based on the information you provided earlier, it stands to reason that a prudent investor might want to take these types of issues into account if they're contemplating entering the emerging cannabis industry, and also how the companies are positioned on these issues. So thank you very much for that. So let's conclude just by looking ahead. How do you see this industry evolving over the next little bit, and what do you think the investor response will be?
Well, this industry is clearly still in its infancy, but it's experiencing quite a bit of momentum in terms of the market expansion, revenue growth, and investor interest. Globally, cannabis revenues are currently estimated to be around $10 billion per year, and projections suggest that revenues will grow to be around $64 billion by 2024. But as we discussed in this report, this hype around legalization may have led to some severe speculation when it comes to the stock prices. We find that this kind of speculation might be baked into the way that some investors are valuing these companies. In the short term, I expect that some of these companies that are riding the wave of investor interest and the general hype around legalization will face some setbacks as the hype wears off and investors look more closely at how companies can sustainably scale their operations and address some of the fundamental issues in their business models. In the longer term, I think the industry will face mounting pressure to internalize costs, especially costs associated with emissions and pesticide use. And regulators around the world will probably look for ways to incentivize companies to reduce their emissions and improve their energy efficiency, as well as address the health risks and environmental risks related to pesticide use.
Great. That's very insightful. Good points, Martin. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today. So I think with that we can conclude. So thank you to all of our listeners for joining, and we look forward to hosting you on the next podcast.
Thank you.